Chris said, my name is Melissa Cronin. I go by Mel, and I'm a new faculty at UMass Dartmouth at our School for Marine Science and Technology down in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I'm super excited to share some of this work with you all that is the product of an amazing team, who I will describe in just a moment. And I want to caveat all of this up top by saying this is all very preliminary. So part of the purpose for this talk is to hopefully elicit some feedback and thoughts from you all who really know this fishery well. But very quickly, just to introduce the research team. So we're working together with Josh Stoll, Teresa Burnham-Knight, Chris, and Joelle from Josh's lab at UMaine and the UMaine Lobster Institute to make this happen. This actually, I came into this project late in the game, and so really all credit to Josh and Teresa who had really cooked up the idea for this. But I'm excited to be working on it now. I like to share a little bit about my history whenever I talk about the lobster fishery. I'm actually new to New England again, but I did grow up in the coast of Maine in Harpswell down here in the bottom right corner. And this is a photo from Bailey Island, which maybe some of you have been to, showing my great grandmother. We have the same glasses style, believe it or not. And she was super fortunate to grow up in coastal Maine nearly a century ago, and of course was exposed to the lobster fishery just like I was. So it was a really important part of my growing up, and perhaps the reason why I'm now a fishery scientist. But like many of you probably already know, coastal Maine is facing its share of problems, including a housing affordability crisis. Like much of the rest of the country, we have rising rents, rising costs of living, and rising housing costs. And this is anecdotally impacting the lobster fishery. So we have sort of stories and reports from lobster captains, lobstermen and crew who are struggling to stay in coastal towns where they work. However, we really didn't have a lot of quantitative data about this issue. And it's potentially really impactful because of the high socioeconomic value of the Gulf of Maine lobster fishery. This is probably a crowd I don't need to explain this to, but we know that 81% of the American lobster landings come from Maine, and the value is something around 400 million ex-vessel value. And this supports 5,000 license holders and 18,000 dependent jobs. But we know that life on the coast is getting harder, or at least getting more expensive. So on the left, this is a figure from Teresa Burnham's 2025 paper in Marine Policy, showing that coastal affordability is decreasing for all regions of coastal Maine, or of Maine in general. And at the same time, we have increasing rate of short-term rentals, particularly Airbnbs, meaning that there are getting fewer and fewer ways for people to actually afford to buy a house or even rent a house on the coast of Maine. Maine is a great place to study this issue because we can think of it as sort of a socioeconomic gradient. And you might hear more about this today, or if you've read Teresa's amazing marine policy paper, you've definitely heard about this, where we have highest dependence on the lobster fishery in the eastern or down east region of the state over here on the right. Hopefully you can see my cursor. And lowest dependence, meaning lowest reliance on the lobster fishery for income, livelihood, etc., in the southern. So you can think of it as sort of a gradient where the mid-coast is somewhere in between those. And we know that coastal housing accessibility has decreased most in the South. If you think about areas like York, Wells, these are areas where we know it's quite expensive to live. And so the questions we really wanted to ask with this study were around participation and demographic change in the lobster fishery and how they might be impacted by coastal housing affordability. The first sub-question on that is, how has the spatial distribution of lobster license holders and residences changed over time? How do patterns in port shed size, which I will introduce to you in just a moment, size and structure reflect evolving patterns of coastal access? And then finally, how do lobster license holders perceive and respond to coastal changes, particularly gentrification, housing pressure, and shifting community demographics? So to do that, we put sort of a mixed methods approach together using some quantitative data and mixing it with qualitative data from fishers. But in order to explain our methods, I need to first introduce you to a port shed, which is a new definition. I believe the idea was brought by Teresa and Josh. I think it's like a super brilliant idea, but referring to the spatial region that links a fishing port to the fishers, vessels, and coastal communities that use and depend on it. So the way we might think of a watershed that links land and sea, a port shed is something that links fishers, communities to their port and their fishery. So we sought to, within portraits to quantify demographic change. So we calculated change in proportion of active licenses per capita by town on the coast of Maine from 1990 to 2024 using data from Maine DMR. We compared residences and anchorage locations for 3 years from 2008 to 2023. And then we calculated change in average commute distance and drive time in GIS. And I'm going to show you some results for each of these calculations, again, with the qualification that these are preliminary results. So first, I'm going to show you how the proportion of license holders per capita has changed over time in coastal Maine. So here on the left, you can see 1990, so just 1 year, and we have the number of licenses per town in these little bubbles, where bigger circles are more licenses, and then darker circles are more licenses per capita. So you can see for some of these licenses, they have, excuse me, for some of these islands, they have quite a lot of licenses, but very small population. So this would be little dark bubbles. But there are other places with large dark bubbles, which means they have both a lot of licenses and a lot of people. So we repeated this analysis for 2024, and then we can look at change over time, which is really nice. So I'm showing you that here on the right. You're looking at change over time in licenses from those 2 years, from 1990 to 2024, with more purple areas being those places that have lost a lot of licenses, darker green areas being places that have gained licenses. So if you spend your time on the coast of Maine, this might not surprise you. We can see increases in licenses in down east areas. And then where I grew up, Harpswell, sort of mid-coast, we've seen quite a stark loss of licenses. In some cases, more than 100 licenses lost over those years. So that's sort of one indicator of shifting licenses, shifting demographics in the coast of Maine. But we can also look at this idea of port shed. So I'm showing you here results for 4 port sheds. We'll talk about, why those port sheds in a moment, but this is just a small number of port sheds. We have lots and lots of port sheds up and down the coast of Maine, and we're planning to actually include all of them in this study. But I'm just showing you 4, so you can kind of get the sense of what we're doing here. And we calculated commute distance from the actual resident, the lobsterman or license holder's residence, which is pretty, I think, high resolution data. I don't come from fisheries with such amazing data. And so you can see the distance, and this is an absolute distance over which a fisherman would travel to get to his port. And this is the port that he's actually stated that he uses, whatever dock or wharf that he uses, not just the nearest port. This map is showing you absolute distance, but actually in our analysis, we're using network distance, meaning over roads. So it's sort of like misleading. It's actually more granular, which is pretty cool in our analysis. And I'm going to show you some results for how commute distance looks over those 3 regions. Again, southern having the least dependence on lobster fishery, mid-coast having moderate, and down east or eastern region having the highest dependence on lobster fishery. So we're looking here at total travel time in minutes on the y-axis. How long does it take you to get to work? And total travel distance on the y-axis here for Portland, Stonington, and Jonesport. I'm just showing you one per region so you can get a sense. And again, this really shouldn't surprise you. So we see that the fishers who travel the farthest and longest to get to their port are in the southern area where perhaps it's too expensive to live on the coast, so they have to live farther inland. Where we see sort of moderate travel time and travel distance for Stonington in the mid-coast, and Jonesport has pretty close. They might be driving just a couple minutes to get to their port or their waterfront access. So we're really pleased to see that this kind of lined up with existing theories or hypotheses that we had. However, what we really want to do is repeat this for all of the ports, all the port sheds in the coast, so that we can see if this is holding over space and if there are some interesting outliers, which we think there are. Okay, finally, we looked at fishers who have moved within the time of our data set. So we selected out just those fishers whose addresses had changed, and then we calculated whether they moved farther or closer to their stated port waterfront access and how far they had moved. And so I'm showing you that here on the left. On the y-axis is number of license holders, and the x is change in total distance with blue. Um, Oops, sorry, with blue on the blue bars on the right being fishers who have moved farther, and on the left, pink being those who had moved closer. So you can see that more fishers have moved farther away from their port. But there are also some really interesting outliers here. Like we're thinking that this guy is not traveling, 300 kilometers a day. So we really want to dig into this data to try to understand if there are people using PO boxes, or maybe there's like licenses that have changed hands. That is not apparent in the data. So we have lots of refining to do here, but I think clearly it's showing that people are moving farther away. We can also look at this on the map, and we can show that, you can see some sort of spatial patterns. Again, this is just for port sheds. So this is not all of the data yet. It will be, but it looks sort of demographically like people are moving inland migrating. Finally, we wanted to get some qualitative color to this story. So we did a process of both combining existing survey data and conducting new interviews with license holders. So we took some of the data from Burnham et al., that marine policy paper I showed you earlier, and we looked at data for real estate, income, and perceptions grouped by those 3 regions in the coast. We also conducted 20 semi-structured interviews with lobster license holders up and down the coast at these sites, and coded those against a code book. I'm going to show you some results for the first part of that, this existing survey data from Burnham et al., where you can see over time the average monthly real estate inventory, how many houses are available for purchase on the coast, has decreased over all of the areas, including inland. And at the same time, they asked they asked community members how much they agreed with the following statement: the lobster fishery in my community is negatively impacted by changing property values. You can see 100% people in the South Coast agree with that statement. So they know, they've seen this sort of already happen. They're completely aware of the fact that, really expensive housing on the coast has prohibited many lobstermen from buying there, at least new houses there. But we see this sort of, again, this gradient as you go up the coast. With mid-coast, there's sort of disagreement over this. Some people disagree with this statement. Some people strongly agree with it. And then down east, we have many people are not really sure. They're actually perhaps not quite impacted as much yet by this problem. I'm going to show you some of the kind of theory that we're putting together. This data is based on our interviews, semi-structured interviews with 20 lobstermen. And we're trying to sort of understand what are common perceptions around drivers of spatial displacement, meaning being pushed away from the coast. And then what are some indirect impacts and direct impacts? So I'll show you each of these really quickly. I won't go too deeply into them because it's kind of wonky social science, but I'm happy to talk about it later if you'd like. So some of the common drivers that license holders reported were things like new residents coming to coastal areas, out competing them in the real estate market, high cost of housing, of course, high cost of other expenses associated with fishing. Many people said, the cost of my rent might not have increased, but the cost of fishing is much more expensive. More vacation, short-term housing, family land loss. We also saw some direct impacts, including longer commutes, riskier fishing behavior. Maybe people, leave really early in the morning and they don't want to go home, even if the weather is bad. And then some indirect impacts, including fewer younger families. Many times fishers would report that they were unable to be on like school committees and local governance, meaning that their interests were less represented. I'm going to wrap up, as I think I have about a minute left. We're putting this together into one large conceptual framework to try to understand how this process happens and how we might predict it happening in newer areas. And so this is sort of a work in progress, but the idea is that new migrants come in and then they might decrease affordable housing, and then this might lead to sort of disenfranchisement and lack of representation in local governance. I'm going to sort of speed through these, but we have some really interesting quotes from fishers, including things like, our fishery turning into a passive hobby rather than a actual commercial business, and complaints around there's nowhere to live around here. The idea of a quaint fishing village, not so much anymore. Okay, so some Implications to wrap up, we know that port sheds are likely expanding as fishers migrate inland. We know that physical separation between fishers and port may weaken community cohesion and governance. And we have some potential recommendations around better coordination across agencies. Fishing agencies and housing agencies might really need to be coordinating if they're interested in long enduring coastal fisheries. We have a lot of work to do still in this project, including refining a lot of the analyses that I showed you today, adding port sheds, and then perhaps incorporating other sources of data like historic photographs, archival photographs of dock infrastructure, private dock infrastructure, and wharf infrastructure. Okay, with that, I'm sorry I threw quite a lot at you. I'm also sorry I can't be with you there today, but I'm super happy to discuss this. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in talking about this work, learning more about it, or sharing your thoughts. We're really eager to get feedback. And I want to thank my wonderful collaborators. This is an amazing team. I'm very lucky to work with them. And thank you all so much for listening. I can take any questions if you have them.
Thanks, Melissa. That was great. So just so those of you online understand, I tried to send out via chat, but there is no chat when you're online. There is a Q&A button, and so if you're going to ask questions, you can use that Q&A, and then I'll be able to field those from the room. So at this point, we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Yeah, so who's our mic runner? I'm our mic runner.
You're free.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Melissa. It's very feedback. Sorry. I'm just gonna, no, I'm not gonna push through. That's tough. Maybe it's better? Okay. My question was, have you started to potentially understand if there's any pattern to where people are moving inland? Are there clusters of people where one initial migrant draws others to that area and fishing communities continue inland? Are there, particular towns that maybe have other industries that have left that make it, particularly cheap to buy land there? Like, I would be curious about that kind of pattern over time of people migrating. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I'm like writing this down. We have not looked at that, but I bet we could, Chris. We'll talk about this, but I wonder if we could look at new like movers and look at their if there are any, movers who have moved to the same location. And I wonder if we could even tie that to property value at the time that they moved. Like that would be so cool. I'll say I don't know, but anecdotally from interviews, many people told me that where they live now, they moved there because there was enough space to keep their traps and um, to buy a house for their family. Most of them have like young kids. Almost all of those people who had moved that I interviewed, which is a small sample, like 10 people maybe, um, they had no community involvement at all in their community, in their new community, which to me, growing up in coastal Maine is actually quite surprising because it was such a vibrant community. So, and they were like, no, I go home because I have such a long commute. So I go home, I see my kids, I sleep, and then I go back to work. I think again, anecdotally, that they have some community at the wharf in terms of like other lobstermen, but not that holistic community where like the whole family is involved in like community and governance, all that stuff. So, yeah, I'll just say like just from those small number of interviews, it didn't seem like there was like an anchor person, but we could totally check that. So thank you so much for the advice. I'm eager to look at that.
Thank you. Hi, I thank you so much for that, Mel. By the way, I'm wearing a sweatshirt that's Bailey Island. I live in Harpswell, but we can get that in a minute. But I'm curious how you're handling latent licenses with some of that data. So the person that you said was like 300 kilometers away or whatever, like, did they stop fishing? Is that why, maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, Chris might be better suited to answer that. As far as I remember, the licenses need to be active. Like, I thought we filtered for active licenses, or maybe that's just in the interview.
I think,
Um,
yeah, I think,
yeah.
Yeah, I think we are doing that. That's a good question, though. There's a lot of things that are just coming up as we go through this data, for sure. But yeah, yeah, just another thing to look at, Mel.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing we keep coming across, as an aside, is like there are so many questions to ask with this data set and like so many interesting things to poke around in it. So yeah, that'll go on the list, latent licenses. Thank you.